I turned 60 with a table set for a birthday party and empty chairs. The last-minute cake was untouched. The candles hadn't even touched a match. The house felt airless, a silence that wasn't rest, but absence. I looked at an old photo on the shelf. There I was smiling, but it was a practiced smile, a smile for external consumption. The body of a boy trying to fit into the family mold. The look betrayed me, and no one wanted to see it, or they chose not to. As I stared at the cake, the question returned like an ancient echo. Why was I never enough for them? The answer was always there. I was different. I was gay. For my family, this was never just a characteristic. It was a sentence, a shame, a threat to the family name. As a teenager, I heard phrases that stuck in me like iron spikes. My father would repeat that he would prefer a dead son to one like me. My mother would wash the dishes and never look up. My brothers practiced the cruelty of laughter. Back then, being who I was meant carrying a target on my back, inside and outside the house. At school, I occupied the farthest corner of the playground, feigning interest in my notebooks. A shove in the hallway, a joke whispered close to my ear, a nickname I pretended not to hear. I returned home with a practiced strategy of barely existing, until Marcelo appeared. He arrived with disheveled hair and a free manner that was at odds with the rigidity around him. At first, we exchanged short phrases. One day, at the end of class, he left me with a look that lingered a little longer than was permitted. My heart trembled for the first time with hope, not fear. We walked together to a modest square and sat on a worn bench. The conversation began superficially, and without fanfare delved deeper. He said he felt different too, that he'd fallen in love with boys before, but never had the courage to tell them. I heard him whole. When his hand touched mine, the world finally made sense. I discovered there was a name for my hunger for affection. I discovered I wasn't alone. That night I returned home with a frightened joy, like someone keeping a burning coal under their coat. The following days were filled with encounters on side streets, planned delays to the last class, calculated steps to escape prying eyes. A first shy kiss, quick, but enough to open a space within me that never closed. I lived divided. On one side, the freedom I discovered on the park bench. On the other, the fear of being discovered. The exchanged smiles began to draw attention. Malice always runs faster than tenderness. Soon came the whispers, the assumptions, the poisonous curiosity. At home, the alarm sounded on a stifling night. My father waited for me in the living room. The table was a courtroom. There were no questions, only a sentence. He said I was bringing shame to the family, that boy was no companion for his son, that if he found out again, I'd be out of the house with a bag in my hand. His hand hit the wood, and I felt the old nausea rise. I slowly went upstairs to my room, sat in the dark, and understood that love would always come at the price of fear. Marcelo tried to resist. We tried for a while. The greatness of a love may not be enough when you're fighting against an entire house, an entire street, an entire city. One day he said, I deserved a world where our hands could exist outside of our pockets. I said, I wanted that world, but I was 15 and had a roof of prohibitions over my head. He walked away. I dismissed my first courage like someone who locks a door from the inside and throws the key out the window. After that, I learned the choreography of survival. I looked like a skilled actor. I talked about girls I'd never dated, invented weekends I'd never experienced, and became an expert in short answers. My body learned not to dance. My head learned not to look. My heart learned to breathe beneath my clothes. The photograph on the shelf captures this phase well. Me in a suit, a shop window smile, family around me, everything as expected. Only I knew the exhaustion of maintaining a character. Decades passed like this. Work, bills paid, Sunday lunches, meetings where I was the proper man, silent, present in body, and absent in soul. Sometimes I walked to the downtown movie theater to find a respite from life in the shadows, exchanged glances, hands touching as if asking for help, a quick kiss on an empty street corner, small gulps of air. Sometimes I fell in, love in secret. Many times I just held on. I returned to the cake table. I touched the icing without cutting. 60 years and a question that never tires. Why was there never room for my love? And another question, newer and more urgent. How much longer do I have left to exist properly? I knew I could no longer postpone this answer. My body was heavy, but the desire to speak my truth weighed even more. It was in this state that memory reorganized my past. I realized that the deepest pain didn't come from strangers. It came from my own. The judgment of the street hurts. The judgment of the dining room bleeds for decades. The father who chose hate as his language. The mother who, paralyzed, believed she could protect by remaining silent. The brothers who carried laughter as a weapon. I needed to learn to see myself beyond this frame. I needed to invent my own arms. The story I'm beginning to tell here is mine, but it's also the story of so many men who walk in the shadow of their own home. Men who married out of fear, not love. Men who learned to act before learning to embrace. Men who celebrated their birthdays in front of untouched cakes. If you recognize yourself, I feel your breath next to mine. I'll open my drawers. I'll show the letters I hid, the nights of crying locked in the bathroom, the secret joy of a park bench, the guilt that wasn't mine, and I carried as if it were. I'll show how the shame of others has become my uniform, and how I'm slowly taking off that garment with the care of someone healing. If listening to me any memory of yours awakened, leave a note below. Write the word courage, or the word strength, or the word truth. I'll read it. I'll know you were with me in this silent room, and that this beginning also has something to do with you. Leave your like now, because it pushes this story to another man who needs to hear that his life still fits within his own steps. And subscribe to the channel, because I will continue to pave the way, and you can walk with me. I'll move on. From now on, each memory pushes the next. The square, the kiss, the threat at home, the mask at work, the marriage I accepted more out of self-defense than desire, the reunions life arranges when it thinks we can try again. I don't promise comfort, I promise truth. I took another deep breath in front of the cake. I didn't cut it. I went to the living room mirror. My face was marked by time, but there was something new in my gaze. It wasn't the boldness of the boy I once was. It was the weariness of someone who's given up on hiding. It was there without an audience that I spoke to myself in a low, firm voice. I exist. I love. I won't apologize for this. If you're with me this far, hold my hand for a few steps. The table is still set, but the party will be different. I'll light candles on my own. I'll name what was denied me. I'll invite the truth to sit. And if there's no chair, I'll stand. When I told myself I would no longer apologize for existing, it wasn't an announcement to the world. It was a whisper in the dark corridor of my own head. I knew courage doesn't come from nowhere. It blossoms when fear grows weary, and my fear had been weary since adolescence. After losing Marcelo, I donned the costume of a proper boy and carried on. I woke up early, studied, worked, helped around the house. Everything was timed, everything was on track. I prided myself on this control like someone displaying a trophy, but inside, I just wanted to be able to breathe without calibrating every gesture. In college, I became a man of few words. People like to call it discretion. In my case, it was strategy. I avoided parties, photos, and dating conversations. I learned the art of appearing busy. Those who are always busy don't need to explain much. When loneliness crept in, I would walk to the old movie theater downtown. I sat in the back rows. There, in the darkness, I remembered I had a body. Sometimes a glance would find me. Sometimes a hand would brush against mine for a second. Almost nothing. For me back then it was almost everything. It was in one of these films that Julio appeared. His hair was already graying, his manner calm. We left almost simultaneously, walking side by side to the square. He said little, I said less. Two men trained to measure each word. We began to see each other without a set schedule, like someone learning to write slowly. It was good company. We fit into each other's silence. I felt a rare peace when he leaned his shoulder against mine. And soon after, the old sting of fear came. I didn't want to lose again. I couldn't bear to see my home become a courthouse again. Julio realized before I did that our story was built on cracked ground. He told me carefully that I needed to decide if I wanted to remain hidden forever. I replied that I already knew how to live in hiding, that the pain of the closet was familiar, and because it was familiar, almost comfortable. The truth is, I confused routine with security. Routine doesn't protect, it only cradles. I was too cradled to notice. Meanwhile, the family cared about appearances as if it were religion. I was the son who inspired pride in my report card and concern in everything else. They asked about girls, planned my future for me, talked about marriage as if it were a vaccine. My mother would rehearse questions and then give up. My brothers kept the old jokes alive. I laughed out of politeness. I often returned from that movie theater straight to the dinner table. my heart torn between the desire to speak and the dread of opening a crack. Over time, Julio grew tired of walking beside me without being able to extend a hand. He didn't abandon me in anger. He was honest about his own need. He said he wanted a complete love. I understood. I nodded. I returned home late that night and washed my face as if trying to remove the scent of life from my skin. That's when I decided that if the world demanded a role, I would play it. Not out of malice, out of self-defense. I began accepting invitations I'd previously declined. I went out with kind women. I invented desires. I showed photographs. I created versions. One day, Clara appeared on this itinerary, sweet, intelligent, possessing a beautiful sense of hope. She didn't ask me for anything at first. I silently thanked her for that. We went out a few times, talked about work, music, her plans. I felt so close to her, as if that affection could save me from the emptiness. Before I knew it, my family was already calling it a relationship. I didn't correct them. I let them. It's hard to admit, but I let them because it was easier to belong with the body than with the soul. Clara brought peace to my routine. I wanted to reciprocate with care, with presence, with the best version of myself. I believed it would be enough. I used catchphrases to convince myself that love could be born from habit. And for a while, it almost worked. We made simple plans, saved money and rented a small apartment. My parents had a new conversation starter in the neighborhood. My brothers lessened their teasing, and my aunts started hugging me again at parties. I was approved. Approval is a silent addiction. With each compliment, a part of me tightened a screw inside. I became efficient. I paid bills on time. I fixed leaks. I carried bags. At night, I lay next to Clara and felt the ceiling very low. I blamed myself for this. It wasn't her fault. I promised to be a home and I was a wall. I promised to be a presence and I was a shadow. In the early hours of the morning, I got up to drink water and stood in the dark kitchen, listening to the clock. I wondered if this was what they call adulthood. At work, I climbed a few steps. My salary improved. People smiled at me in the elevator and asked about my wedding. I responded with stock phrases. I already had a repertoire. Sometimes, on the bus, I'd see two young men laughing guiltlessly. I'd look away like someone shielding their eyes from a strong sun. Other times, I'd pass Julio on the street. We'd exchange a short, respectful wave, like someone who knows there's no point in stirring up a river that needs to flow in another direction. Time passed, and my fear learned new tricks. One of them was justification. I kept telling myself I had no right to ruin anyone's life, that I was now responsible for a home, that my teenage years were behind me. But the truth doesn't age. It waits. Sometimes it whispers in the supermarket. Sometimes it calls your name in the aisle. Sometimes it sits next to you on the bus and accidentally touches your knee. I lived two parallel threads. On one thread, the dedicated husband, the trustworthy son-in-law, the upstanding professional. On the other, the man who still reminded me of the park bench and a kiss that opened a window in my heart. I thought I could keep the threads separate forever. A rainy Sunday warned me that this was impossible. Clara spoke of her desire to have children. She detailed names, bedroom colors, dates. As she spoke, I felt a void too great to contain myself. It wasn't fear of being a father. It was dread of repeating with someone else the prison I knew so well. I spent days in silence, careful not to hurt her with my lack of answers. I brought flowers, cooked, was attentive, tried to convince myself that this could work. I wanted to earn her trust. But at night I would turn to the side and my heart wouldn't follow. I understood her every gesture and still couldn't reach it. It was during this time that the old box began to take shape. Photographs, a dedication, clippings I'd kept without realizing it. I hid the box in the back of the closet, as if hiding objects were the same as hiding reality. The family celebrated our engagement with cake, music, and conversations about the future. My father was prouder than he'd ever been. My mother hugged me with the care she hadn't given me as a boy. I received that belated affection with gratitude and a sadness hard to explain. It was as if approval came at the price of an amputation. I smiled in the photos, but I knew what was outside the frame. The wedding was simple, beautiful, and honest on her side, and anxious on my side. I prepared as if I were about to start a marathon. I took a deep breath, promised presence, promised fidelity, promised secrecy without realizing it. At the reception, I danced with my mother and felt a childlike peace for a few minutes. On my honeymoon, I tried to be whole. I returned home and worked even harder to justify the ground I had chosen. The new house smelled of paint and promise. I bought a sturdy table to accommodate the family on special occasions. I put up curtains and hung pictures. Every domestic gesture was a way of saying I would stay. I wanted to stay. I tried with all my might, but the right forces weren't with me. Away from myself, I was always half. With Clara, I was generous in my care and sparse in my brightness. She deserved light. I knew it, and yet I kept trying to light my wet match. When the body demands honesty, it starts with the small signs. I was often sick. I slept poorly. I forgot my keys, was late for appointments, lost my appetite, and suddenly I ate too much. The body speaks as it can when the mouth doesn't. I thought it was stress. I bought vitamins. I read about productivity. I made lists. Nothing worked. I had a real problem and treated it with stationery. In the midst of this phase, I received an invitation to a work get-together. I almost didn't go. I ended up going out of politeness. Someone brought a microphone and asked everyone to give something to say thank you. It was my turn, and I thanked them for their ability to endure. The room applauded. I smiled. On the way home, sitting on my bed, I realized the absurdity of the statement. I had become an expert at enduring. I didn't want to die a champion of enduring. If you've ever found yourself grateful for your own ability to endure, leave a comment with the phrase, "I know the price of silence." This space grows when we name what has crushed us. Also, leave your like now. It makes this story travel and reach those who need to hear that they are not alone. And sign up to walk with me part by part, unhurriedly, without a mask. I close this chapter without fireworks. I close with a man sitting on the couch, staring at the box he hid. Inside, an old newspaper clipping, a photograph of two boys on a park bench, a handwritten phrase I've always wanted to forget. I know the next fold in this story will shake walls I've spent decades building, but I promised myself I'll no longer apologize for existing, and promises like these don't lend themselves to postponement. I opened the box on the table like someone pulling the blanket off an old wound. Inside was everything I'd told myself I'd overcome, a note I'd kept since my youth, a yellowed photograph of two boys on a park bench, a dedication in a cheap book that seemed valuable only because it held a piece of us. I touched each object carefully as if it were possible not to awaken the past, but the past truly awakens when we ask for silence. I spent a long time staring at that life I'd hidden from myself and the world. It was as if a window had opened again, offering air, and I, out of habit, closed the curtain. That week, sleep became a rebellious animal. I lay down and got up, went to the kitchen, counted steps in the hallway, made up lists to feign control. My body warned me I was living against my will. I tried to blame work, the economy, fatigue, but I knew it wasn't the schedule, it was the lie. Lies weigh more heavily on the pillow than any debt. Clara noticed before I even confessed. She noticed my lost gaze, my mechanical gestures, my rush to do everything, and my absence in almost everything. One night, while I was showering, she opened the closet for a blanket and found the box. When she came out, the photograph was on the living room table. She didn't scream. There was no scene. There was the silence that demands an answer. She asked what that story was, and who that boy beside me was. I tried to explain it, without flourishes, without heroism, saying that the photo captured a love that woke me too soon, and that I buried so I could move on. She took a deep breath, said she deserved the whole truth, and that she couldn't bear to continue being married to a ghost. We slept on our own side of the bed, as if two islands had formed between us. The following days were a series of discreet goodbyes. We drank coffee, trying not to hurt feelings, divided tasks without arguing, and avoided making promises. I offered to leave the house. Clara said she didn't want war, she wanted dignity. We talked about dividing bills, furniture, deadlines. Deep down, we were both trying to salvage something whole from the shipwreck. I wrote a short letter, thanking her for her kindness and apologizing for mistaking presents for a mask. She left another on the table saying she hoped I'd find my own name. Packing your life is a gesture that teaches a lot. I stuffed shirts into suitcases and realized how many empty hangers remain when we decide to truly exist. I set aside books, left dish towels, and put the extra keys in an envelope. Before leaving, I cooked for both of us. We ate in silence, without rancor. She told me I was a good man who chose the wrong path. I replied that I no longer wanted to survive by shortcuts. We exchanged a long hug, the kind that seals the end with respect. I carried my bags to the elevator and felt my heart beat in a new rhythm, at once light and frightened. I rented a small room with a window overlooking a busy street. The noise helped me think slowly. I bought a simple table, a chair, and 2 cups. At night, I washed one and left the other clean, as a vote of confidence in a future I didn't yet know what it would hold. On my first weekend alone, I walked to the square. I sat on the bench that reminded me of the photograph. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was a kind of encounter with myself, with the boy who never had a defense. I told him that from then on, we would try to do things differently. The family felt the tremor without understanding its origin. My mother called asking for Clara. I said she was fine, but that we needed time. My brothers sent me frugal messages, full of subtext. I decided not to rush into confessions, because I was still short of breath. First, I needed to stand up straight in front of the mirror. When news of the separation leaked, there were guesses about failure, immaturity, crisis. People like an easy plot. I wouldn't offer one. What was at stake wasn't a romance that ended. It was a man who decided to stop imitating. At work, I kept up the pace. I arrived early, met deadlines, smiled in the hallway. Little by little, close colleagues began to notice that I was breathing differently. One said I seemed lighter. Another asked if I'd started walking again. It's curious how the body decides to let the world know when the soul finds some repair. I continued discreetly, without making any major announcements. But, inside, a foundation was beginning to shift. At night, I would open a notebook and write short sentences. It was an exercise in relearning. I wrote that I wasn't a mistake, that my life was worth more than what was expected of me, that courage isn't a shout, it's a step. Some memories came back, like a tide. I thought about Julio. I wondered if he still lived on the same street, if he still went to the same movie theater. I considered looking and decided not to rush. First, I needed to learn to walk without the cane of secrecy. One rainy afternoon, I sat in a cafe and watched 2 men discuss household bills, the grocery list, the price of electricity. No romantic scenes, real life. I felt a good envy, the kind that points the way. I longed for a daily routine where I could hold hands and complain about expensive bread. I longed for a banal Sunday that would fit my name. Clara and I followed with respect. She changed the color of the living room wall. I learned from a photo she sent without a caption. I installed a cheap curtain and sent a picture of the sunset shining through the fabric. There was no provocation in these gestures. There was care for what had survived. I promised myself I wouldn't tell our story as if it were a mistake. She was a shelter I misused. Shelters aren't to blame for the fear of those who arrive. When loneliness gripped me, I would breathe and remember the reason for everything. I had decided to exist. Deciding to exist is costly, but it's the only thing that balances out in the end. And if you, listening to me, recognize this tightness in your chest, this desire to drop the mask even if it hurts, write in the comments the phrase, "I want to live fully." Your comment isn't just a gesture to the channel, it's a message to yourself. Take advantage and leave your like now. It pushes this story to those who need a push of courage. And subscribe to Walk Along, because the next step requires company. It's a simple evening, with clothes hanging on the makeshift clothesline and the smell of coffee in the kitchen. I put the extra cup on the drying rack and think that one day it will be used. I don't know by whom, I just know it will be on my desk, with no hiding place. Tomorrow I'll open the window early and face the street with my full name. Fear still walks with me, but now it doesn't choose the path. I choose. I woke before the sun, as if my body were in a hurry to experience what I'd postponed for decades. I opened the window, let the morning air in, and repeated in my mind that from now on, I would walk with my full name without asking permission. I made coffee, washed the extra cup, and left it on the drying rack as a simple gesture of someone preparing a place for life. I texted Marcelo saying I needed to walk, alone for a while, and that we'd meet up later. It wasn't a withdrawal, it was the opposite. It was courage testing one's own legs. I made my way to the square where it all began, the same one where my silences and my first responses began. The wooden bench no longer felt like a stage for guilt, but for a new beginning. I sat down, watched the comings and goings of the neighborhood, and noticed that the eyes were still measuring me, some cold, some curious, one or two welcoming. I breathed, and Remembered the phrase I wrote to myself in the letter kept inside the book. I exist. I repeat it softly and feel my heart beat on the right side of my chest. I returned to the group of mature men late in the afternoon. The room was simple, the coffee lukewarm, the chairs in a circle. Paolo said he'd managed to tell his son he had a partner. Antonio said he'd learned to cook for two after a lifetime of empty tables. When my turn came, I said I'd faced my family and left in one piece. There was no applause, but something bigger. There was a row of eyes that understood the journey and restored a kind of peace to me. At the end, a younger man, who sometimes participates as a guest, thanked me for not lowering my head. I kept that gesture as if it were proof that moving forward also teaches. The next day, I accepted the community library's invitation to give a brief testimony. It wasn't a lecture, it was a conversation. I explained that the shame they inflicted on me isn't mine, that the guilt they inflicted on me isn't an inheritance I accept. I spoke of Clara with respect, because her kindness can't be relegated to the same drawer as the violence I suffered. I spoke of Marcello with the dignity he lends me when he holds my hand, even when the world turns up its nose. At the end, a woman told me that her grandson was afraid of who he was, and that my story would open a window. I left without feeling my feet. I returned to the church where I volunteer. I needed to walk the same aisles without bowing. I arranged chairs, organized donation bags, greeted those who wanted to greet me, and didn't force anything on those who didn't. The coordinator called me in for a chat. I heard his concern about the group's image and replied that my presence there was work, not a flag, but that I wouldn't leave my truth hanging on the door hanger. He nodded without promising anything. I left with the feeling that sometimes the only possible negotiation is respect. Marcello was waiting for me at the exit with two still warm loaves of bread. We walked to the park bench. He recounted memories I'd never heard, of the fear that also guided him, of the times he thought there would be no more time to love without disguise. I listened in silence, and it was beautiful to realize that we both learned the same verb in different tenses. We don't talk about eternity, we talk about today. Today was enough. In the neighborhood, rumors still blow like a cold wind around street corners. The woman at the bakery uses a slurred tone when she serves me. Two old colleagues cross the street to avoid me. A childhood acquaintance chuckles softly when I'm just a few steps away. I understand the mechanism, but I no longer accept the ritual. I walk, pay, thank them, put on my patience and move on. Between one harsh gesture and another, I find signs of light. A young neighbor stops me at the gate and says he admires my calm. A couple offers me a place in line at the health center. Pun-free. Alvaro, an old friend, appears from time to time with silly jokes and a firm shoulder, and I accept the lightness as an antidote. I looked for my mother again. I brought fruit, sat on the step, and talked about the weather, the street, the price of beans. I don't force doors, I just stay close. She took a while to leave, but she did. She didn't hug me, nor did she kick me out. She said she didn't know how to be a mother to a son like me. I replied that being a mother was enough. We'd learn. The rest as we walked. She gathered the fruit, asked me to leave the bag, and in that simplicity there was something important. Small cracks let in air. That night, I was overcome by an old, familiar sensation. My body froze, my breath shortened, a grip of nameless fear trying to lock me in the past. I sat on the living room floor, leaned my back against the sofa, and counted to 100. Marcello stood by me without question, with a healing presence. When my chest calmed, we arranged an appointment with the group psychologist. I accepted. Taking care of your head also means taking care of your heart. There's no shame in asking for help. Shame is repeating the pain out of pride. I started a simple routine that feels like a map. A light walk in the morning, a text a day to clear my head, a call to someone important, an honest conversation with myself in the mirror, a dish I learned to prepare with Marcello. Small things, big pillars. I discovered that freedom smells like a pot on the stove and an open window. I discovered that intimacy is being able to talk about bills and at the same time listen to old stories without fear of falling apart. I wrote Clara a letter of peace. I thanked her for the care she gave me when I didn't even care for myself, apologized for what was a mistake, and told her I hoped her life would be made of truths that embrace her. I received a short, beautiful reply. She said she also wanted to move forward with ease, that she hoped I would stay strong. I kept the letter among my fond memories. The dignity of an end sustains futures. One Friday, The group organized a simple gathering. I brought a notebook with notes from my adolescence. I read a passage in which I described my fear of being seen. My voice faltered, but I continued. When I finished, I asked anyone at home listening to this story, online or on local radio, to leave the word courage in the comments. Not to please me, but to signal to those still trapped in their dark rooms. Each comment is a light shining in someone's window. If this story resonates with you, write courage. This helps the video reach those in need and gives me the strength to continue telling it without shrinking. Before bed, I confirmed with Marcelo the short trip we're planning. It's not an escape, it's a celebration. A nearby city, a sea that fits in your eyes, a clockless afternoon. I want to step onto the sand as if signing an agreement with myself. I've come this far, and I want to go. Further, I want to sit at a random kiosk and ask for 2 chairs, not to feign friendship, but to occupy a place in the world with my love in peace. I lay down and realized the street noise no longer penetrated as before. There was fatigue, yes, but it was the good kind. The kind that comes after a day lived head-on. I thought about my mother and the fruit, the neighbors, the church coordinator, Clara, Paolo, and Antonio, the young men, Marcelo breathing beside me. Life wasn't perfect. It was possible. Being possible is a beginning we learn to honor. I woke with a clear head, as if the night had swept away old dust. The day scheduled for my first session with the psychologist arrived without drama, and I walked slowly, training my body not to flinch. In the simple room there was a soft armchair, a potted plant, and a table with scarves. I sat and let the words flow at their own pace. I told her about my adolescence, my marriage, my encounter with Marcelo, the night I leaned against the sofa to keep from collapsing. She listened to me with silent attention and returned something simple. Shame is inherited fear, not identity. She asked me to notice when the body shrinks and what shrinks it tries to protect. I left with a small and enormous task. Every time my throat closes, take 3 deep breaths and remind myself that now I have a choice. I kept my promise to celebrate the beginning of life. Marcelo and I hit the road on a clear Saturday, heading for a stretch of sea close, enough to fit half a tank of gas. The coastal town didn't have a picture postcard, and that's exactly why I felt at home. We stepped onto the cool sand, sat facing the wind, and opened a package of bread and cheese, laughing at the luxury of not having to explain anything to anyone. I told him that freedom felt like a muscle, sore at first, firm later. He nodded and rested his head on my shoulder. We didn't make grand plans. We only agreed on the essentials, to care for the present like one would water a plant. Back in the neighborhood, the world remained the same and felt new. The bakery lady wasn't overly blunt, and that was a step forward. Alvaro appeared on the sidewalk to lend me a book and stayed for a short coffee, the kind that heals without theory. The volunteer coordinator accepted my presence without any awkward remarks. I noticed I had changed too. I no longer apologized with my eyes. I did my job and moved on. With each gesture, an extra inch of solid ground. My mother gave the first sign in days. It wasn't a phone call, it was a simple package left at my gate, with vegetable soup and a short note saying the food was fresh. There were no apologies, no promises, just shy care. I wrote a thank you on a piece of paper and took it to her door. I rang the doorbell and left the reply on the doorstep. Then, sitting on the step, I realized that relationships sometimes begin again in the stomach. I accepted the gesture as if accepting a late spring from the support group came another invitation to speak at an open circle at the library. I wanted to decline for fear of becoming a symbol, but I understood it was for all of us. I spoke about what silence does to the bones, about how lies turn into a stone in the chest, about the day I decided I would no longer be a discrete statistic. There were respectful questions, and a young woman said that her uncle, the same age as me, was trapped in the same dark room. She asked for advice. I replied that there is no shortcut, only a network. One step at a time, accompanied, is worth more than running alone. At the end, I invited anyone listening to write in the comments, "I keep moving forward," not to collect phrases, but so that others recognize a possible path. I returned home and organized my papers. I found photos that had hurt me for years and now served as a map of what remained and what would go. I separated what I still wanted to keep and discarded what belonged in the old paper. Among the things was a forgotten card from Clara. I didn't read it with guilt. I read it with gratitude. I called to thank her for what we were able to save from the shipwreck. She answered with adult sweetness, wished me well, and said she was fine. I hung up with a calm heart, like someone closing a window without locking it. I started walking around my neighborhood with no escape routes. I passed the barber shop and greeted Mateus, who asked when I'd get my hair cut. I felt proud to answer tomorrow without thinking there was a code behind it. I stopped at the market and helped a lady reach a package on the high shelf. She smiled and commented that I looked lighter. Maybe I really am. Being light isn't being free from pain. It's just not carrying the pain hidden. The psychologist suggested a farewell ritual for the boy I was. I went to the cemetery to visit my father's grave. I didn't bring flowers. I took a letter. I read quietly that I was ending the cycle of hatred that wasn't mine. I said I wouldn't live to prove anything, that I would choose to live because life deserves honesty. I left without spectacular relief. I left with a feeling that the world's gravity had been fine-tuned in my favor. Social anxiety throbbed again when two childhood acquaintances saw me with Marcelo in the square. Their gaze carried the old threat of ridicule. I felt my throat close, remembered the task, and took 3 deep breaths. Instead of backing away, I greeted them naturally and kept walking. Marcelo noticed and shook my hand without exaggeration. My body learned a new choreography, elegant without bravado. Last night I wrote a list of things that ground me: walking, cooking, reading, serving, loving. I also wrote down what no longer fits me: empty excuses, parties where my existence needs to excuse me, conversations that start with jokes and end in wounds. It's not a manifesto, it's a pocket guide. If you're with me on this journey and recognize a step of your own in mine, write in the comments and I'll keep going. This helps the algorithm bring this story to those who need it and reminds me that the voice of a mature man can also open doors. Breathe with me now, 3 times, and remember this phrase: the truth doesn't shout, it sustains. I woke up early and let the kettle sing slowly, as if summoning courage for another day. The house breathed a new air, and I wanted that air to reach my children slowly. I invited Helena and Daniel for a simple lunch. Short messages, clear affection. They responded with a mature yes, as if each of us were willing to experience the same table differently. I cooked like my mother did, but I changed a seasoning here and there, rewriting memories over low heat. The table was unpretentious. 4 plates, juice, bread, and an old tablecloth stretched imperfectly. I wanted the space to say without words, this house no longer lives on excuses. Miguel arrived with still warm bread. He discreetly kissed my cheek in the hall and joined. In the preparation, like someone who sews daily, he cut tomatoes, tasted the salt, washed the salad. When the doorbell rang, my chest pounded like a 15-year-old. I opened the door. Helena led the little one by the hand, Daniel following close behind. There was that second when your eyes measure the terrain. I made my way to the kitchen. The food did the rest. We talked about work, household bills, Sunday's game. The little one insisted on showing off a card trick. He messed up. We laughed. He tried again. We laughed some more. At one point, Helena placed her hand on my wrist and said she appreciated my effort. Daniel, still economical with his words, said it takes time for the body to learn new routes and that he was ready. I poured more juice, and I felt an old weight slip from my shoulders and fall to the floor. A few days later, I went to the church's volunteer work distributing food baskets. The coordinator took me aside. He said some people were worried about my visibility. I listened without arguing. I replied that my role there was to carry boxes, organize lines, and welcome those in need. He nodded, somewhat unsure, and returned to the courtyard. In line, a woman called me my son and asked me to tie the bag. I'll love it. I understood again that humble service disarms rumors better than rhetoric. At the front gate, I found a pot of my mother's soup. It was less salty, as she prefers. I returned it with a pumpkin jam I learned from Clara. I wrote on the note that I was fine and that I would leave food there whenever she wanted. No reply came. I put the lid away, shining like someone who keeps a gesture. With Miguel, we inaugurated small habits: walking after dinner, watering plants early on Sunday mornings, exchanging books at the neighborhood library, and reading passages aloud. On one of these walks, we passed a cousin who pretended to answer the phone to avoid my gaze. The old ice tried to lift. I kept pace. Miguel commented that certain bonds are neither broken nor completed. They just change shape, and that our job is to not surrender our souls to the pride of others. The psychologist left me a question for the week. What in me tries to hide when another's gaze weighs heavy? I started jotting down short answers on pocket paper, at the bakery when two men whispered, on the bus when an acquaintance stared at me longer than he should, in the supermarket aisle when I heard a whispered comment. Writing didn't erase anything, but it did remove the secret from the darkness, and the darkness has always been fear's best friend. I received an invitation from the support group to speak with parents trying to understand their children. I accepted with trembling hands. In the circle, a man said he feared losing his son to a cruel world. I replied that the world is less cruel when the home is a port, not a shipping company. A mother asked how to welcome someone without knowing what to say. I replied that welcoming is a verb before a sentence. A proper hug is worth more than a manual. Leaving, I breathed exhaustion and gratitude. I realized that my story, the one that had so often weighed me down, could be a bridge. On Saturday, I went to the market with Helena. We stopped at the pasta section and talked about a future without grandiosity. I told her I don't plan heroism, just continuity. She told me her little one wants to see me at the school performance. I promised to go. Simple promises build safe bridges. Earlier this week, Rita wrote, she said she was fine, that she was following my steps without spying, and that she didn't want war. She asked me not to disappear from her children's lives. I replied that being present was always my goal, even when I took a wrong turn. Maturity visited us like a silent agreement, without accusation, with measure. I returned to the volunteer warehouse on a day of light rain. The smell of coffee and damp clothes permeated everything. A young woman told me she had been kicked out of her home. I handed her the group's card, wrote down a shelter contact number, and told her she wasn't alone. As I spoke, I recognized the teenager I once was, leaning on my own fear, wanting to disappear and be seen at the same time. At home, I opened the windows and let the air exchange places with the walls. I made garlic rice, chopped fruit, and soaked the beans for the next day. I wrote on a piece of paper and stuck it on the hallway mirror. I exist without asking permission. I passed by the paper 3 times before believing it. The 4th time, my body understood. Late in the afternoon, I walked with Miguel around the block to the barber shop. Mateus waved from the window with rare ease. An older customer looked me up and down and twisted his mouth. I held Miguel's hand tightly, not out of defiance but out of caution. We passed the usual cafe. Donna Inés left an extra napkin on the table and left without comment. The gesture earned me a hug. I started sleeping better. Not every night, but enough to wake up with a fuller chest. In my dreams, the landscape changed. Gone was the doorless corridor, and into a small square with benches and low sunlight. Every now and then, the old fear still rears its ugly head, but it arrives late, too breathless to dictate the route. If your story is also negotiating spaces, write in the comments, I exist without asking permission. This helps this story reach its target and can ignite courage in those still half-breathing. Like and subscribe so more mature men can find a viable path. Today, I walk with small but firm steps, and I keep going because I've learned that truth doesn't ask for a ride, it learns to walk. The following week, the neighborhood announced an open mic in the square for community messages. The sign taped to the lamppost said any resident could speak for 3 minutes. It wasn't a stage, just a box with sound wires, but that tiny square seemed larger than many an auditorium. I passed it twice, pretending not to see it. The 3rd time I stopped. I felt the old mix of fear and desire, my body wanting to retreat, my soul asking for a step. I told Helena late in the afternoon. She smiled in her usual direct way and said she'd be there, without the spotlight, without a presence. Daniel responded with a dry okay and added, it makes sense for you to say who you are, without shouting. Miguel, who knows me inside and out, didn't make a speech. He simply took a pen from his pocket and handed it to me as if to say, write. I didn't write much. Short, breathable sentences like someone building steps to avoid tripping. I slept poorly. I dreamed my voice was thin and the microphone was failing. I woke up laughing at my exaggeration, made coffee, and recited my draft to the pots and pans. The sound was good enough that I didn't give up. I arrived early. The wind blew leaves and a few curiosities. Donna Inés served coffee at a side table. Mateus, from the barber shop, adjusted the microphone, stand as if adjusting a haircut. The volunteer coordinator arrived with that formal smile. I greeted everyone, sat on the bench with Miguel, and let the sun warm my fingers. Helena appeared with the little one and a bag of cheese bread. Daniel arrived wearing a cap and remaining silent. I straightened up inside. They called my name in the order listed on the file. I walked calmly. The crate creaked under my weight, but it held. I held the paper with one hand and the microphone with the other. I said I was born on that street, that I had long carried a secret as if it were guilt, and that at 60 I was learning to exist without asking permission. I said the house cannot be a police officer, that the right hug is worth more than any manual. I spoke of the boys from the 1979 square that I never was. I spoke of the fear that consumed my youth. I spoke of the relief of holding hands today without turning it into a war. I asked for respect, not at a party. I asked that everyone take care of their own backyard and the next. There was no cinematic applause, but there was a scattered, sincere clap. The man from the newspaper lowered his chin in approval. A young woman said strength without theatrics. The woman from the bakery nodded without bitterness. A cousin in the background rolled his eyes and fiddled with his phone, like someone who prefers rumor to reality. I climbed down from the crate with the legs of a teenager and the chest of a man. Miguel squeezed my forearm. Helena held my shoulder. Daniel gave me that short touch that means we're together in our own way. On the way home, I received 2 types of messages. Some said congratulations, courage, we're here. And some said I was looking for attention, that I was already talking. I read both and felt at peace for a simple reason. Finally, it was no longer silence speaking for me. The voice now had an owner. The next day, my body took its toll on me from the tension. A tightness in my chest woke me before sunrise. It wasn't a big deal, but my old mind is making a big deal out of it. Michael took me to the clinic. The doctor listened, measured, and asked about my time. She said that old stress likes to change clothes when life changes, and that I should pay attention to my sleep, water, and pace. It wasn't a red flag. It was an invitation to pace myself. I left with a simple prescription: walk, talk, sleep, and return. I obeyed as best I could. I cut back on coffee in the afternoon, stretched early, and closed my bedroom door half an hour early to summon my body back. And I added a gesture of my own. I started writing letters I don't need to send. One was to my father, not to fight, but to bring closure. I wrote that I survived without his blessing, and that it hurt, but that now I no longer negotiate my skin. I took the letter to the cemetery, placed my hand against the cold stone, and left the paper under a vase. There was no lightning in the sky, no music. There was one less thread pulling my chest back. Another letter was for my mother. I didn't deliver this one. Instead, I cooked the pumpkin jam again, took it to her house, and left it on the gate with a short note. I'm here. Late that afternoon, I found the pot washed and a folded napkin. Thank you. I saved that thank you like someone saving water for the summer. I returned to the support group and sat in the circle next to the parents. One man spoke of his fear of seeing his son suffer at school. I said that no pain diminishes with a child alone, that the first hug needs to be the one at home. A mother confessed to being afraid of misnaming things. I replied that trying to get things wrong is almost always better than pretending to get it right. At the end, a young boy waited for everyone to leave and told me he called his mother after hearing my story. She cried, he cried, and they agreed to cook together on Sunday. It was the most beautiful compliment I've ever received without the word compliment. The neighborhood continued doing what neighborhoods do, testing. A man spoke loudly about strange times in the bank line. I took a breath and followed. A young woman led the way in the grocery aisle with a smile big enough to fit a cup. I thanked her like someone receiving a blanket on a cold night. On the bus, a teenager asked me if it's true that you can be happy after 60. I said that happiness doesn't have an ID, only practice. With Miguel, life continued without fireworks. We fixed a small leak in the laundry room, replaced the living room light bulb with warm light, and planted chives in a can. We laughed about 2 failed recipes and celebrated a loaf of bread that finally rose. He asked me if I wanted to travel after the high season was over. I said yes, but for now the best destination was to continue fitting in street by street. He understood. Helena invited me to the little one's presentation. I went. I sat in the middle row and clapped for everyone. When he entered, he tried to find me in the audience. I discreetly raised my hand. He smiled, missed a step, corrected it, and continued. At the end, he ran up to me and said he'd practiced a joke. He delivered it poorly, and we had a good laugh. Daniel appeared near the end, gave me a double pat hug, and asked if I was sleeping better. I said yes. He said he still gets scared by some comments from acquaintances, but he's learning to respond with maturity. I told him we'll get better, together. If your path is also calling for fresh air, write in the comments, "I walk without a mask." This simple gesture helps this story find other men who need to breathe without disguise. Like and subscribe, because your presence keeps this space going and sparks good conversation for those who still speak softly. I follow, not always brave, but whole enough not to turn back. And if I stumble, I've learned to get back up without apologizing for existing. On Monday morning, the volunteer coordinator asked to talk before the activity. He called me into the small back room, the one with the coffee-stained table and a crooked crucifix on the wall. He spoke quietly, evasively. He said some people were uncomfortable with my new way of being. He used words like prudence and testimony. I listened without crossing my arms. I replied that I hadn't come to teach anyone how to be me. I just wasn't going to pretend anymore. He took a breath, scratched his chin, and suggested I take a break from the more visible tasks. I said I could stick to the inconspicuous ones, stacking chairs, sweeping, organizing donations. He agreed with relief. I left there understanding that when the bridge is narrow, we cross sideways, but we do cross. On the way home, I found a note scrawled on my gate. I don't repeat the words. They were old, smelling musty. I called Miguel. Instead of taking pictures to harbor anger, we grabbed paint and a roller. We painted over them without a word. A boy from the neighboring building appeared with a small brush and asked if he could help. He could. He filled in the edges diligently and told me his mother had said that insults don't enter where there are people who care. I gave a short laugh. We finished the job in pleasant silence. The wall was smooth. So was my chest. That same afternoon, I found a bag hanging on the gate. Inside was a dish towel, a small jar of pumpkin jam, and a note in familiar handwriting. "Stop by when you can." It was from my mother. I went the next day. I brought fresh bread. She opened it slowly. Her face was more wrinkled than I remembered, but her eyes were the same ones that taught me to tell the difference between rain and drizzle just by the smell. We sat at the table without fanfare. We talked about small things, the gas, the dripping faucet, the soap opera, until she asked if I was okay. I said yes, in my new way. She asked if Miguel respected me. I said yes, with the patience she always asked of her children. She nodded and fiddled with the towel. Then she got up, went to her room, and returned with an old photo. Me, a boy, smiling crookedly beside her. He handed her the photo and said he doesn't know how to go back, but wants to learn to go on empty-handed. I held it up and said it's something. Before leaving, she offered me 2 glass jars, the kind used to store everything. I took them as if receiving a blessing without words. At a farmhouse, the neighborhood woke up buzzing with conversation. Someone posted a photo of the open mic and mentioned my name. Compliments and barbs poured in. A distant cousin wrote that I was aging badly. I deleted the notification and called Helena. She laughed. He said a neighborhood's reputation lasts less than hot bread. Daniel suggested a rule. Don't argue in the comments, argue at the table. I accepted. We decided that on Sunday we would have lunch together without an agenda, but with everyone present. Lunch was at Helena's house. The table was simple, the pot steaming, and children's laughter ran around us. Daniel arrived with juice. Miguel brought salad. We talked about household chores, the electricity bill, the price of tomatoes, a persistent leak in the kitchen sink. Little by little, the more serious topics emerged unhurriedly. Helena said a friend asked if I was okay. She said yes. Then I seemed lighter. Daniel said a classmate teased him, but he ended it with, "I love my dad," and that was enough. There was no fight. There was family learning another cartoon. At this point, I began receiving small invitations to share my story outside the group. A technical school in the neighboring neighborhood invited me to speak at an open class. I went with butterflies in my stomach. The room had a noisy fan and attentive-looking students. I spoke without a long script. I told the boy who heard hard things at the kitchen table. I told the teenager who loved with fear. I told the man who married trying to survive. I told the man in his 60s who decided to stop apologizing for existing. A boy wearing a cap raised his hand and asked how I dealt with the sideways glances on the street. I replied that sideways glances and light rain, annoying, but not for the world, and I have an umbrella. Another student wanted to know if courage arrives all at once. She said that for me, courage came in a spoonful, but it arrived. The teacher thanked me at the end. At the door, the school janitor stopped me to say he had a grandson who needed to hear that. I held back tears and told him to take his grandson out for ice cream without questioning. Sometimes we just need ice cream and an ear. On Saturday, Miguel and I decided to do a little home renovation. We painted the living room light, removed a heavy painting that had never been ours, and made room for a bookshelf. While tidying, I found old boxes. Inside, unsent letters, receipts from lives I hadn't lived, photos I'd kept out of habit. I made a pile for what stayed and another for what went. I burned some souvenirs in the backyard, safely and carefully, like someone returning to the air the weight that no longer needed to be with me. Miguel stayed by my side without checking my choices. During breaks, he played soft music, called for drinks of water and cut fruit. The afternoon ended with the house smelling of paint and my chest smelling of beginnings. The church remained a place of measured measures. I continued my backstage tasks, without a microphone, without a spotlight. A gentleman greeted me with a lingering handshake. He said he had a son who disappeared years ago. He asked if there was still time to strike up a conversation. I replied that while there's breath, there's a door. Another lady offered me a mint, one of those simple mints, and whispered that she was praying for me. I didn't discuss theology. I thanked him. Sometimes things move through the doorway, and that's okay. There were also those who tried to pull me back, into the dark corner. An acquaintance of my father's came with a talk of nature, of righteousness, of shame. I listened to the end, because education is also resistance, and I responded only with my life. I said I breathe better now. I said I sleep without negotiating with my head. I said I'm no one's agenda. I'm a man who finally fits in with himself. He ran out of words. He pressed his lips together and walked away talking about the weather. When the month turned, I received an invitation from the community radio station for a lunchtime chat. I agreed to the condition that I speak as a neighbor, not as a polemicist. The interviewer was kind. He asked how our routine changes when we come out, and after 60. I spoke about the short list of gains that seem silly to those who have never hidden. I spoke about the first good morning that holds no secret deep down. I spoke about getting a haircut without fear of a misleading question. I spoke about walking through the market without measuring my gestures. As I left, a lady recognized me in the hallway and said she has a nephew who is silent. I asked her to bring cheese bread and patience. Haste makes names wrong. I came home wanting to cook. I invited Helena, Daniel, and my mother over for Sunday snacks. I told them it would be simple: bread, pumpkin jam, white cheese, coffee. My mother confirmed her presence with a small, okay. The table looked beautiful without being fancy. Helena brought juice. Daniel brought a deck of cards for the little one to practice tricks. My mother sat at the end and watched. Little by little, she joined the conversation. She asked Miguel what he liked to cook. He answered stroganoff and pudding. She told me my father had a weakness for pudding. The air wasn't heavy, it was lively. In the end, my mother got up, went to the kitchen and washed 2 cups, as if rehearsing a move to a new house. That night, I went to bed feeling lighter. Not because everything was resolved. You don't solve a long story with a handful of snacks. I went to bed feeling lighter because I realized that life is more about stubbornness than trauma. We insist with affection, and something gives way. If this story is making you breathe differently, write in the comments and I choose to continue. Your comment will open this conversation to more men who still walk with a slow pace. Like and subscribe, because that keeps this space alive and brings more people closer. The following week, I woke up with a new certainty in my chest. It wasn't euphoria, it was solid ground. The family snack had left small silent marks. My mother washing 2 cups as if clearing a path, Helena texting to see if I'd slept well, Daniel asking if I needed help with the leak. The house still had ancient echoes, but with each passing day I heard less of the creaking of fear and more of the simple sound of life. Early in the afternoon, the official invitation to the open mic in the square arrived. The neighborhood notice had become a calendar. I said I would attend. I didn't promise a heroic speech, I promised presence. Miguel smiled briefly, that cornered smile that calms me, and said he would stay close, not crowding me. I arranged with Helena and Daniel to show up if they wanted. It wasn't a test to pass, it was a park bench with music playing. I spent the week getting the house ready for whatever might come. I organized papers, sorted bills, cooked beans to freeze. Practical things calm me. At night I wrote little notes that I might read over the microphone, little pieces of paper with direct sentences. I exist, I love. I breathe better now. In the end, I put everything in the drawer. I decided I would speak while looking at whoever was there. The day before, I went to volunteer. The coordinator asked for 2 minutes. He said he hoped I'd be happy, but that the community was still in its infancy. I replied that I was also in its infancy. Crawling isn't falling. It's a way of moving forward. I agreed to stay behind the scenes, stacking chairs. He nodded. As I was leaving, a man handed me a folded piece of paper. Inside was a phrase, "Call your son." It wasn't signed. I thought of his son who disappeared years ago. Maybe the phrase was meant for him. On the appointed day, I arrived early at the square. The sun shone brightly between the clouds. The stage was simple. 2 speakers, a worn microphone, and a tarp for shade. The cake and craft stalls filled the path with their scent. I sat on my usual bench, the same one where I relearned to hold hands. Miguel sat next to me without clinging too closely. I took a deep breath. When my name was called, I went. I stood up, adjusted the microphone, and searched for faces. I saw Helena nodding, Daniel with his hands in his pockets, my mother in a light dress under the tree. I didn't force my voice. I spoke of the boy who learned early that words could hurt. I spoke of the teenager who hid for survival. I spoke of the man who tried to fit into other people's frames and forgot how to sleep. I told him that after turning 60, I decided to trade the mask for breath. I didn't use grand terms. I simply said that the shame wasn't mine and that I was tired of asking permission to exist. I gave small examples: cutting my hair without fear, buying bread without looking down, saying good morning while feeling that the good morning was mine. As I spoke, the noise of the square continued. Children ran, dogs barked, a pot banged against the corn stand. I liked this. Life didn't stop to listen to me. It listened to me along with its own haste. At one point, a distant cousin stared at me near the bandstand. He lifted his chin as if preparing to attack, but stayed. There was no shout. There was a silence that preferred to listen to me. I finished the way I know how. I asked whoever was there and carried a secret to write a word somewhere, in a notebook, on a cell phone, on a napkin. Write like this: I'll be whole. We need to repeat this until our bodies believe it. If these lines are making you breathe deeply, comment "I'll be whole" below. Like, subscribe, because this gesture opens this conversation to other men who haven't yet found their voice. The applause wasn't explosive, but there was a warm, scattered applause from people who don't need to agree to respect. I stepped off the stage, my leg trembling slightly. Helena hugged me from the side. Daniel patted my shoulder twice, our way of sealing peace. My mother stood in the shadows and I went to her. There was no speech. She held my fingers for a few seconds as if verifying the hand was indeed mine. She said a short sentence, like a mother who still stumbles but tries. I saw you. That went through me like a warm shower on a grey day. Miguel appeared with a glass of water. He didn't ask how it was. I thanked him, sipping slowly. The 4 of us walked across the Portuguese stone floor, like a family finding a new footing. I noticed glances, some cold, some kind. A gentleman at the bar cracked an old unfunny joke. No one responded. The joke fell on its own on the pavement. In the following days, the neighborhood did what neighborhoods do. They commented, exaggerated, and forgot half of it. I received 2 messages from strangers, mature men saying they saw themselves in what I was saying. One asked for advice. I wrote that I have little advice, but I can offer company. I offered a park bench and ice cream. They laughed back and promised to think about it. The family moved slowly. Helena kept the door open. Daniel wavered between silence and curiosity. My mother sent 2 small containers of food and a message without a final note. If you need anything, call. Clara didn't write. I understood. Stories don't rewind. We honor what was and don't drag on anymore. That night, I sat on the porch and opened a box I'd saved from packing. Inside were letters from me to no one. Letters I'd never sent. The dates were spaced out, 1 decade, leaping from the next. I read excerpts and realized I was repeating an old request: let someone see me. I smiled sadly. I put all the letters in the envelope and decided what to do with them. I didn't burn them. I saved them to take to my father's cemetery. Not to apologize, but to return them. Some things no longer belong to the living. The next day I told Miguel I wanted to go to the tomb, not to fight with the bones, but to end a conversation I'd been having alone. He said he'd go with me, if I wanted. I did. We agreed to go in the late afternoon, When the sun was setting and the city's voice was quieter, I put on a shirt my mother had complimented me on at lunch, grabbed the letters and a handkerchief. I stopped at the bakery and bought bread for when I got back. I like to come home smelling of simple things. Before I left, I wrote on a piece of paper stuck to the fridge, just for me to read when I got back. Courage isn't a shout, it's a step taken. If you're with me this far, leave a comment. It's not a pretty phrase, it's a tool. And if you can, hit the like button and subscribe. It's not vanity, it's reach. There are too many hidden men who need to hear that life can start over after 60. I closed the gate and walked with Miguel in silence. The afternoon wind blew lightly. I knew that before that tombstone I would say little, but my whole body would understand. What was to come next wasn't theatre. It was a farewell to fear, and I was ready to take another step. The cemetery gate creaked like it did in my childhood. I entered with Miguel at my side, and the box of letters pressed against my chest. We walked unhurriedly past the names and dates that remind us that time passes for everyone. I stopped before my father's headstone. I didn't come to apologize. I came to end a conversation that never existed. I opened the box, smelled an old drawer, read passages where I repeated a request in 1,000 forms. See me. I placed an envelope on the stone and spoke softly, more to myself than to him. I exist, I love, I remain your son, but now I walk in one piece. There was no sign. There was relief. Leaving there, I bought simple flowers at the gate and went to my mother's house. She opened the door slowly, like someone expecting a storm and finding drizzle. We stood face to face. I told her about the cemetery, the group where I first spoke into the microphone, the letters I'd kept for so many years. She took a corner of the bouquet and led me to the kitchen. She made coffee in silence and, amid the steam, said she couldn't walk as fast as I do now, but wanted to try slowly with me. I nodded. She touched my face with her fingertips, as she had when I was a boy, and I let the cup tremble without hiding it. The house was filled with the sound of people again. Helena arrived with the little one and a new notebook. Daniel was late, but he arrived. Miguel opened the cupboard, found a pan, and invented a sauce. The table was filled, with duplicate dishes and crumpled napkins. Daniel said bluntly that he still gets confused, that he'll have a bad day, but he'll stick around. I replied that we don't need to pretend to be light-hearted, that the truth weighs heavily and builds strength. The little one drew 5 people and wrote family. I didn't correct him. It was the drawing I could think of at that moment. The city did its part. At the barber shop, Mateus asked for the usual clipper and said, "See you tomorrow." At the bakery, Donna Marcia said good morning, staring me in the eye. At the market, a cousin who had previously wanted a fight preferred to remain silent in the hallway. I didn't provoke him. Some battles are won by living. I returned home with fresh bread and one certainty. Routine also teaches us lessons if we don't give up on existence. With Miguel, I found the middle ground, holding hands when my body demands it, hand in my pocket when the environment sets traps without losing my rhythm, not hiding and choosing. The night became less heavy. I sleep without negotiating with ghosts. I wake hungry. I make my bed slowly. Life gains color when we breathe fully. In the late afternoon, we walk in the square. A neighbor waves, another swerves. A child offers candy at a traffic light. The world doesn't change all at once, but cracks open. I returned to the group. I spoke less, listened more. A man shared that he called his grandson years later. A young man said he considered leaving but gave up. I said, "That courage isn't a wall, it's a bridge. If you need to cross, write 'I choose the truth' in the comments. Writing helps the body remember its purpose. If this story helps you, like and subscribe. This puts our voice on the path of those still walking in the dark and in need of company." The separation from Clara went smoothly. We met to sign the necessary agreements. She had the serenity of someone who stopped inventing a future. I apologized for the time I was absent. She said she'll be fine, and asked only that I remain present as a father and grandfather. I promised. The little boy's drawing was stuck on the fridge with a fruit magnet to remind me of the agreement. Truth and care are on the same team. Over time, my mother started calling on Sundays. They're short, slow calls. She asks about my day, Miguel's, the boys. I respond without forcing conversation, respecting her breath. One cold afternoon, she called for soup and told me to bring whoever was walking next to me. We did. She served 2 plates and started talking about the neighborhood, the price of tomatoes, the church. There was no speech. There was the simple gesture of someone who's learned a new word and still spells it carefully. On my birthday, I decided not to repeat the forgotten cake scene. I bought a small one with candles without numbers. I called out whoever fit. I blew it out slowly and silently, thanked the air that entered and left without guilt. I washed the dishes with Miguel, while the little one tried another card trick. He messed up and laughed. We laughed together. The house learned the sound of laughter that doesn't ask for permission. Maybe you think I was lucky. It wasn't luck. It was a step, a fall, a step. It was a closed door and another ajar. It was people who chose to lose me and people who found me. It was my mother's words, "Let's go slowly," Helena's hand on my shoulder, Daniel's direct way of asking me not to disappear, Miguel's discreet care letting me breathe in my own time. And it was the decision to stop asking permission to exist, a whole life fitting into others, now fitting into myself. If you've made it this far, it's because this story captivated you from beginning to end. I want to extend a direct invitation. Subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss future intense stories like this one. This keeps this space alive and allows me to bring you narratives that truly touch you. If you watched until the end, comment the word resistance below. This way I know you were with me until the very end and are part of this journey of courage and truth. Don't forget to leave a like, because it shows that the content resonated and helps spread this message to more people who need to hear it. And enjoy. The next video is already on your screen. Click and stay with me because the next story may touch your heart even deeper.